Hey, everybody. This is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries. I'm delighted to have Gavin Roberts with me on the broadcast today. Gavin is a Christian brother from the land down under, from the great continent of Australia, and he is a part of the Evangelical Presbyterian Church of Australia. Gavin, how are you? Glad to have you. How are you doing?
I'm going good, Joe, and thanks for the intro. Some people say Australia doesn't exist, but I'm living proof that it does. I've been here for a long, long time, and it does exist. Yeah, so great.
So that is the topic of our broadcast today is, does Australia exist? And we can quit right now.
Yeah, okay. That's the end of the video. It does.
Yep, we're all done here. Nothing else to record. But no, that is not, in actuality, that is not the topic of our video today. Today we are going to be talking about a topic that may seem controversial to some, but is an important topic. We are going to be talking about what the Society of Jesus, which is more commonly known as the Jesuit Order. They are an order within the Roman Catholic Church. They are an order that has been founded to fight against Protestantism, which I take as simply another word for biblical Christianity. And they are a group of people which are very influential in the political and economic and social goings of this world at the high levels of power. So that's where we're going to start today. And our goal is not to, quote, Roman Catholic bash. We are not trying to be hateful toward Roman Catholics, but we are trying to bring awareness to this topic. We are trying to speak the truth in love. We're trying to show people that there is an abundance of historical evidence to show that this group has had very sinister dealings historically and that those things are still going on in the present day. Gavin, do you want to comment upon that before I'm going to read a quote here in a moment?
Sure,
do you want
sure.
to comment on that to start out?
Sure, Joe. Similar views. I have no hatred for those people. In fact, like both my wife and I come from strong Roman Catholic backgrounds. Our family has a window in one of the local churches dedicated to our family for their service to that church. So it's not something where I hate that organisation. Dearly loved members in it from our family that are still there, and my hope is that they would be saved.
Yeah, amen. Perfect. Now, we're going to be talking about a lot of history today, and one of the things we're going to be trying to demonstrate is that godly Christian men throughout history have been aware of the Jesuits and their work against Protestantism and the Protestant Reformation. And I'm going to start by giving an example of that today. I'm going to be reading from a book. Get in front of the camera here. This book is a book by Charles Spurgeon called Geese in Their Hoods, Selected Writings on Roman Catholicism. For the viewers who do not know who Spurgeon was, he was a particular Baptist preacher in London in the 19th century. He was a very gifted preacher. He has been called the Prince of Preachers at times. And he was, even though a very charitable man, he was known to have a warm and loving heart. He was under no illusions about the threat of Jesuitism in his own day. So I want to just read this quote here to set the tone of what we're talking about. And this is what Spurgeon had to say about the Jesuits. He said, "But for truth's sake, our Protestantism must protest perpetually. Dignitaries of the Papal Confederacy are just now very prominent in benevolent movements, and we may be sure that they have ends to serve other than those which strike the public eye. A priest lives only for his church. He may profess to have other objects, but this is a mere blind. Our ancient enemies have small belief in our common sense if they imagine that we shall ever be able to trust them, after having so often beheld the depths of Jesuitical cunning and duplicity. The sooner we let certain archbishops and cardinals know that we are aware of their designs and will in nothing cooperate with them, the better for us and our country. Of course, we shall be howled at as bigots, but we can afford to smile at that cry when it comes from the church which invented the Inquisition. No peace with Rome is the motto of reason as well as religion." Charles Haddon Spurgeon. So I think that really shows what Protestant Christians in the past have known about Rome and about Jesuitism. And it really shows about how Christians have thought about this in the past. What do you think about that, Gavin?
Sure. At that time when Spurgeon was writing, it was commonly held belief that A, that the Pope was the Antichrist, and B, that the Jesuits were the enemies of the Protestants. And that's faded now. There'll be a very small percentage of people in the world that would still hold to those sort of views.
Yep. There's a small remnant today of conservative, godly Christians who still hold those views, but they have become few and far between in the evangelical world, and they are spread out all across the world. So that's a view that's really only held by small pockets of Christians today compared to the many professing evangelical Christians. And that's a great start. But let's backtrack here. Let's just start out by can you, for the viewers, please just tell us what is the Jesuit order? Let's just break that down a little bit more than we already have, and we'll go from there.
Yep. Let's wind back as far as we can go. So, to Bible-believing Christians, the world was created by God in 6 days, and He rested the seventh. So that's a fundamental view of Christianity, and many Christians don't hold that view, believe in various degrees of evolution. But it's plainly taught in Genesis that there was Adam born and his wife, Adam created, and his wife created from his rib. And it wasn't long before they fell into sin and ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so immediately after that, God approached them, and we know the story there. But the important thing is in Genesis 3:16, He said, "I'll put enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent." And so in our world, there are only two types of people, either the seed of the woman or the seed of the serpent.
That's right.
So we have the story of Cain and Abel as the first falling out of that promise, where they were both asked to sacrifice. Abel brought a sacrifice that was pleasing to God, and Cain brought one that was not pleasing to God. And so that enmity showed forth and came to fruition when Cain slew Abel. That has persisted, that mentality, throughout the world, so that's the start of the anti-Christian hatred, if you will.
Yep.
And so it came along, and I suppose it came to a peak of our knowledge at the time of the Reformation. Luther had been a devout Roman Catholic and studied and eventually came to the conclusion that, hey, this is wrong. And he nailed his theses to the door of the church. And that, I guess, was the beginning of the Reformation.
Yep.
Well, the Roman Catholic Church wasn't going to take that lying down, because that went against everything they stood for. And they would have killed him if they could have got hold of him, but his friends protected him. So that led to the formation of the Jesuits by Ignatius Loyola, and they've been there ever since. Notably, they've been banned from almost every country in the world.
That's right.
And the consequences of doing that have been very severe. So we won't probably dive into that, but they've been hated by kings and popes even. Popes have banned them and banned the Jesuit Order to their sad consequences in many cases.
That's absolutely right. And I really like how you started by going back to Cain and Abel, because when we're talking about Protestantism and the Jesuits, we're really talking about this spiritual warfare that goes back to the rebellion that started with Satan, with Adam and Eve's sin that you mentioned, and the division between where every person who alive today is either in the kingdom of God or they are in the kingdom of Satan. And that goes back to Cain and Abel. So I'm really glad that you brought that out. And I'm glad that you mentioned Martin Luther. And Martin Luther, like you said, was in the Roman Catholic system, He was a monk in the Roman Catholic system. He famously said if any monk should have gotten to heaven by his monkery, it should have been him, because he
Yep.
was trying to get saved through good works and penances and all the rest of it. And he realized that it was impossible. And he also realized it was unbiblical. And so God used him to bring a recovery of biblical truth that had been lost for hundreds of years during the Middle Ages. And then, recapping what you said, Rome wanted to stop that revival and that movement for Reformation in the professing church. And they turned to this newly founded order called the Jesuits from Ignatius of Loyola, who was a Spanish soldier who became a priest, who had visions of the Virgin Mary and believed that he was supposed to be a soldier for Christ. And when he got his order approved by the Pope, he said, I will be a soldier for the Roman Catholic Church, and my express purpose is to destroy Protestantism. That is the purpose for which the order was created. And they, even though they have wanted to get political power in every country, in every place in the world, and they want all religions under the Pope, their greatest enemy has always been Bible-believing Christianity.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they're being highly successful lately in shutting that down.
That's right.
Anybody that wants to be a Bible-believing Christian. I noticed on YouTube the other day, a guy in England was arrested for silent prayer. So
that's right.
That's how far it's come.
Yep, that's absolutely right. And and one more comment before we go to the next question. I think it's important. The reason why the Jesuits are one order within the larger Roman Catholic Church. So not every Roman Catholic is as fanatical as the Jesuit priests.
Yeah.
But the reason why they are so fanatical, they are the shock troops of the Roman Catholic Church, is because they are trained in a very specific way, where they are given very intense religious training. They have to go through what are called the spiritual exercises, which is a form of Roman Catholic mysticism and religious meditation. This is done in special meeting houses for novices before they become full-fledged priests. And what they are essentially doing is mentally and psychologically breaking down the individuality of the novice so that they will learn that they are supposed to be completely subservient to their superiors within the Roman Catholic order.
And they can lie or murder or do any manner of sin and be totally absolved.
That's absolutely right.
Of the order.
Yep. Jesuit morality says that you can be a chameleon and you can be whatever you have to be in order to get your purposes forwarded. And as you said, they are not above going to assassinations or murder or a big thing they have done is infiltration of Protestant churches. That's been going on for hundreds of years. And they use deceit and manipulation and whatever other tactics they use to get their way.
And chameleon is the right word. And they can lie under oath. The bottom line is the end justifies the means. So bottom line is they can do whatever they like with complete absolution.
Yep, that's right. And Loyola famously said that he could get a novice to say that snow is black if the hierarchical church told him so. So, Okay, I think we've laid an excellent foundation to move forward. So for the viewers, for the rest of this video, we're essentially going to go through this timeline chronologically, and we're going to talk about some of the great events of history to give people an overview of what we're talking about so we can illustrate that foundation we've just laid in the first 14 minutes of this video. So why don't we start? I know that you did mention the Protestant Reformation briefly. Do you want to comment upon that any further?
Yeah, there was a few things that happened. About the same time, the printing press was invented and the word of God was spread out through Europe and the British Isles. And the Church of Rome hated that. And Tyndale, for example, was burnt at the stake for doing that. And many, many others were burnt for, if you're found with a Bible, you surely would be put to death. If they could catch you. So the hatred of the word of God is probably the key issue because it shines a light on these practices of this denomination. And it's not as if it's all wine and roses within it either. You've got many orders, as you said, like the Benedictines hate the Jesuits and vice versa. So it's not as if it's a universal brotherhood of love. There's much animosity between different factions within that organisation. But that hatred even goes back before the Jesuits that brought it to a peak. But the Waldensians in northern Italy, for example, were murdered and thrown off cliffs, and I think they got wiped out, maybe not completely, but they were hunted and killed for their beliefs as Protestants in the time when the Church of Rome ruled.
Yep, that's absolutely right. And really, in the early centuries of church history, the Roman Catholic Church gradually came into being. I think it really, in its full-fledged form, I really kind of see it coming into being around the time of the reign of Charlemagne. At the very least, the idolatry came in much earlier than that. The veneration of Mary came in much earlier than that.
So but the history of that would probably start in the 3rd century, 300 AD, with Constantine declaring all these things and blending. And this is probably getting to further down the video, but let's go there. Blending the pagan religions together and calling it Christianity. And so the Christians at that time started this ecumenical movement of joining with the anti-Christian forces with maybe not Mary at that time, but crosses and Christmas and other things. A bit of a sidetrack digging into those. But
that's okay. But
that really of the Roman Church.
Yep, that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about here. And just to recap, the Roman Catholic Church is essentially a form of Babylonian paganism, and it's a mix of many different forms of paganism, really. But it has Christian. I like to say it has Christian wrapping paper on it. So it has an outward veneer of being Christian, but in its inward heart, it is pagan, and it is Roman and really chiefly Babylonian paganism.
Yes. But also from Egypt, if you look at that, those hieroglyphs from Egypt, you can see the symbols of the cross with the loop on the top in Egyptian hieroglyphs. So much of that, and Tammuz, the sun god, and all those things blended in. And people love idolatry rather than the truth. And there would have been many that refused it and possibly were killed, but they hid in the catacombs and they persecuted, from day one.
Yep. And there's a great book on this topic called The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop. I know you're aware of that book. Yep. And he was a Protestant minister that lived in Scotland in the 19th century. And he wrote what is, in my opinion, the definitive work exposing the Roman system. And he goes into
part of those Christmas trees and Yule logs and kissing under the mistletoe, all of those. Every one of them. The book goes through every one of those pagan things and links it directly back to paganism.
And it gives a lot of good example. Like the priests of Horus in ancient Egypt, Horus was their sun god, and they would have a practice of elevating the host, a bread cake that they would bake. Yep. And we see that essentially in the Mass today.
Yeah, and Jeremiah says they bake cakes to the Queen of Heaven.
Yes, and it's amazing. I think that is irrefutable that Jeremiah, as you just said, denounces a deity called the Queen of Heaven, and Mary today is called the Queen of Heaven. That's an official title for Mary. Yeah. So this is why it's called the Two Babylons, because of the fact that there was the old Babylon of the Old Testament period, and it typologically points forward to the new Babylon. That's referring to Revelation 17 and 18. The city on seven mountains or seven hills is Rome.
Hard to miss.
It's the new Babylon, and this is
pretty hard to miss.
This is what Bible prophecy teaches. And so we have this pagan system, and I'm just going to try to bring us back forward toward the Reformation a little bit here, that this system kept the people in the dark for centuries in Europe.
Yes.
So true Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, but Satan tried to corrupt it by bringing in all these doctrinal errors and this paganism and this idolatry. Yes. But then when you get to the Reformation, the Bible had been illegal for thousands of years, and then many true Christians, as you mentioned, like the Waldenses, were persecuted and they were put to death and they had to hide in the mountains of Italy. But then God starts raising up these men like John Wycliffe and John Hus and Martin Luther. And many of these men started in the Roman Catholic system, and they saw the errors of it by reading their Bibles because God gave them access to the Bible. Yeah. And this started to bring about a process of things changing. And this ball got rolling so quickly that the Roman Catholic Church said, if we don't do something to stop this, we're going to lose all our power. And that's when they turned to the Jesuits. And they said, you guys need to infiltrate those churches. You need to kill them, murder them, lie to them. You need to stop this by any means necessary. And that's essentially the same war we're living in today. This has been going on for 500 years. And really, the spiritual war has been going on for 6,000 years.
There's a slight difference with at the time of the Jesuits. So we'll get to talk about the Huguenots, and we briefly spoke about the Waldensians. So the Jesuits, as you say, originally killed the Protestants. So they tried to stamp it out by killing them. But just as in ancient Rome, they tried to stamp out Christianity by killing them. But it just spread like wildfire. The more they did it, the more they spread. But the Jesuits woke up that this isn't working, and they've got a much better plan. And part of that plan is not only to infiltrate churches, but to infiltrate the teaching organisation. One of the first things that the Jesuits did was start schools and universities.
Yep.
And the Roman system says that if I can have a child to the age of 7 years, I've got him or her for life. And that's what they did. So they start these kindergartens, preschools, even today, and universities, and they're educating people subconsciously into these things.
Yep, that's
the
right.
Don't even know.
Yep,
in the main.
And they recruit people out of these university systems, and they try to raise them into high levels of power.
Yes.
I'm sure this is the same with the politicians in your country, but using the United States as an example, there is a large number of presidents and secretary of states and cabinet members and members of Congress that have gone to Jesuit universities for their schooling and their training. A good example
is the famous one that they have to go to, like George Bush went to.
George Bush was a member. He went to Yale. He was a member of Skull and Bone. But a good example is Bill Clinton was explicitly trained at Georgetown University.
Georgetown, that's the one I'm thinking of. Yeah.
In Washington, D.C. That's probably the most famous Jesuit university in the United States of America.
Yeah.
And Clinton is even on record of saying if he hadn't been trained by Jesuit professors, he says that he probably would not have been president of the United States.
Exactly. Not a chance.
Well, that's excellent. So we've really covered, I think we've covered the rise of paganism into the Roman Catholic Church. We talked about how in the Middle Ages, how it was a time of darkness. We talked about the Waldenses, and we talked about the Reformation. The ball really got rolling with Martin Luther.
And you mentioned John Huss, or Hus, you said, but there's a classic example of where he was promised safe passage if he would appear. And we're not going to go with that. We're going to kill him. So even though he was promised life, he was given death.
Yep. Yeah, he was supposed to appear before a tribunal, and he lived in Prague, which is in the modern day Czech Republic.
Yep.
And he was promised safe passage.
Yep.
And there was
even by the king.
Even by the king. And they lied to him. They deceived him. And he as Christians who are often very loving and kind are usually when people are lying to them, will usually give them the benefit of the doubt.
Yep.
And that is the way the Lord's ordained it, that people will, the same thing happens with William Tyndale. He gives the benefit, he's deceived by a friend, and he loved a man who took advantage of him. Yep. And this is the way that history go. It's a common story, and that John Hus was put to death. And some people, if you read Fox's Book of Martyrs, he he has famous words at the burning of the cross that would appear to, he said there will be a goose that you will not be able to cook. And some people think he was predicting the coming of Luther and the Reformation, even though there is some dispute about that. But it's a very interesting story. But there was a whole group of followers of Hus after his death called Hussites, and the Roman Catholic Church launched crusades to try to kill them off.
Exactly
there's over 10 Hussite crusades. There was a succession of them, of these invading armies coming again and again and again to kill
these kings coming to defend them. With their armies.
And Luther,
that's continued on to almost this day. Serbia and Croatia would be the modern version of that. Probably people today don't remember that in the time of Clinton, as you're talking about. He bombed the Serbs for war crimes, but that's a continuation of that Hussite rebellion.
Yep, is absolutely right, because there has been ethnic hatred between the Croats and the Serbs. The Croats are Roman Catholic and the Serbs are Eastern Orthodox. And Rome has tried to get the Eastern Orthodox under their thumb the same way they've gotten tried to do this with Protestantism. And they will often use the same methods against the Eastern Orthodox that they use against Protestants.
Well, they pretty much succeeded in Russia with the Russian Revolution. They wiped them out almost.
So, that's great. So I think we've covered sufficiently the Reformation and even the Counter-Reformation. Why don't we move forward to France and the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and the events with the Huguenots, as you mentioned. So why don't you summarize those historical events for our viewers?
So when the Reformation came, it was taken up in France, and there were many believers, and a group called the Huguenots, most famously remembered as devout Christians. And this was an irritation to the king, who was Roman Catholic, and he gave an order to get rid of them. And on St. Bartholomew's Day, they were massacred in the street. Old, young, babies, women ripped apart with children. Horrendous. And the most horrendous thing was that the Pope gave out a medal to celebrate that thing. And a most horrendous event. We probably won't be talking about the Holocaust in our living memory, but that's mentioned with horror. If anyone mentions that, it's just, wow, how could that happen? But it pales into insignificance to the atrocities that have been committed against Christians over the years.
Yep. And some people may say, how could you compare the killing of Protestants to the Holocaust? But it is not an exaggeration to say, if you go back into the Middle Ages, that hundreds of millions of Christians have been murdered by the papacy. That is not a historical exaggeration. If you look at the groups like the Waldensas or the Hussites or the Lollards in England or the Huguenots, there's many of these groups that we have not talked about extensively.
And if you speak to someone today, even a devout Christian, they in many cases have no idea of the Huguenots.
Yep, that's right. And just to give a little bit more context to what you said very well, is that the Huguenots were Protestants, but they were French Calvinists. So they believed strongly in the sovereignty of God. They believed in predestination. The term Calvinism is somewhat anachronistic to them, but that is what they believed.
Yes.
And they had a strong view of sovereign grace, which is the true gospel. The true gospel is not a works gospel. It is a gospel of sovereign grace.
And by the way, every false religion is a religion of works.
That's absolutely right. And works religion
and that goes back to Cain. Goes right back to when we were talking about Cain and Abel. Cain had a religion of works. God will be pleased with the sacrifice. This is what I think he'll like. No, he didn't like that.
He thought his good works would cover him, but it was will worship. He was trying to worship God according to his own reason, his own dictates, instead of being subservient to how God told him to worship.
Yep.
Yeah.
100%.
And I just want to comment here that works religion always takes you to one of two places. Either it takes you to a place of Pharisaical pride, where you become self-righteous, or it leads you to despair because it
Yep.
cannot save you.
Correct.
So if you become very devout in a works religion, you will either become puffed up with pride and become a hypocrite like the Pharisees, or you will realize that you cannot save yourself and you will be in a place of hopelessness. That's
Yeah,
what
and to go back to the Jews, I'm not on a Jew message here, but at the time of Christ, the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the scribes came to Christ, and he told them these things back then. They didn't want to have a bar of it. That they were his chosen people, and they rejected him.
Yep, that's right. Yep, absolutely right. And so we were talking, and then the Huguenots, as you said, there was a long series of these wars in France they were called the French Wars of Religion, and it led up to this time where there was a ceasefire between the Huguenots and the Roman Catholics,
Yep.
and Henry of Navarre, who had been a leader amongst the Huguenots, was going to marry uh, someone from the Roman Catholic Party, and they launched their massacre in the midst of this wedding in Paris. And it took place not only in Paris, but across France, and they murdered
Yep.
millions of Huguenots across France at the same time in a
Yep.
very highly organized and synchronized plan.
Exactly right.
And it was orchestrated by chiefly Catherine de' Medici, who was a Roman Catholic, very evil queen of France.
Yes. Yes.
And with the help of the Jesuits. Those are the parties that were responsible for orchestrating this massacre of Protestants. And as you said, the Pope was so joyful about this great victory for what he believed to be the true church. He was so happy at the bloodshed and the cruel bloodletting of these people that he had that medal that you mentioned to commemorate this great victory for their cause.
Yep. Yep. And as a side issue, I can't quite get my head around this, but in the book of Revelation, the 10 kings and one was not. Some writer that I read said, as a consequence of the evil doings at that time in France, led eventually to the French Revolution, where millions of those perpetrators were, because that was the nobility that organised that killing of the Huguenots, and they were murdered in horrible circumstances with the guillotine. So whether that's true or whether that's just joining the dots where the dots aren't meant to be joined, it's worth thinking about.
It is. And I think you're correct about that. I think that when you look at the history, Henry IV of France, he had been Henry of Navarre. He had been a leader of the Huguenots, and he did sin because he converted to Roman Catholicism in order to get his throne. But it was providential, though, because after God put him in there, he had the king. The king issued what is called the Edict of Nantes, which allowed freedom of religion in France, so that the Huguenots were not persecuted any longer after this massacre. So God extended mercy to his people, even through the sin of this king who had formerly been of their religion.
Yeah.
But what happened is then generations later, Louis XIV, who had a Jesuit as his confessor, revoked that edict.
Yep.
And the persecution of the Protestants resumed in France to the point where they drove them all out.
Yes.
Then they went to places like North America or even to South Africa and to other parts of the world. And so by the time the French Revolution comes about, there's no Protestants. Bible Christianity is gone from France.
And the interesting thing about that, Joe, is the skilled workers and artisans were scattered, like you say, to the United States, England, and that broke France because they had no industry. They had, we hear about the Protestant work ethic, and that's it to a T. That took off, and you're left with a rabble, if you like, and that rabble, as Queen Mary said, let them eat cake, or whether she did say that or not, we don't know, but we get the idea that they were furious, and that revolution happened.
Yep. I think that
they were in poverty.
Yeah. I think the French Revolution was a judgment of God even specifically for those past persecutions of Protestants.
Correct.
Because that very same Roman Catholic monarchy that had persecuted the true church for generations, finally, it was you reap what you sow, and it was turned around back.
God is not mocked. Yeah,
Yep.
God is not mocked.
And I don't want to get too far down this trail, but I think if you interpret Revelation according to the historicist method, you can even argue that the French Revolution is prophesied in the book of Revelation. But I don't want to get too far into that because that's going to lead us off track.
Off track.
Yep. And so, and that's really good. And I like what you said, because I believe that the Protestant work ethic is certainly a real thing. And I think history has demonstrated
It made America great.
It made America great. I would say I think it made your country down under great. I mean, it is true that all of the English speaking countries have been very prosperous.
Many of the great inventions that have come forth. Look at Scotland, the stuff that Scotland has produced over the years, the inventions. Can't even begin to name them. But
it's amazing.
Telephones and TVs and refrigeration and radar, and, electronic, the World Wide Web, all these things. Came from Protestant nations.
The country that I would say has had the highest concentration of true Christians in history has been England.
Yes.
I would say the United States is close behind.
Yes.
We've sent so many missionaries out to the world, but when you look at some of the great Christians, the Wycliffes and the William Tyndales and the Puritans, the Westminster Divines, the Spurgeons, there's so many others I could name. The George Whitfields, they've all come from this little country.
Exactly.
And that Bible-saturated country has been a blessing to the entire world.
And Holland too. Holland, the Dutch sent out many missionaries.
If you read the Dutch divines, and they were Calvinists, men like the men who wrote the Synod, who were at the Synod of Dort, the Canons of Dort are excellent theological articles. One Protestant minister who I've really enjoyed, some of his stuff has been translated into English, is Wilhelmus of Brockel. He is very theologically accurate, and also can be quite devotional at times. But yes, the Dutch were great merchants. This goes back to what we're talking about, the Protestant work ethic. And that has not always been true to the same extent in the Roman Catholic countries, because they still have been caught up in superstition and paganism and idolatry. And God has not blessed them, even materially, in the same way that he has blessed the Protestant countries.
My wife and I visited America some time ago, and we went from California down to Mexico, and stepping across the border, it's like unbelievable, the difference. Once a Protestant country with nicely trimmed lawns and white markings on the guttering of the road and beautiful sealed roads, and dusty, shake the dust off your feet when you get to the other side. And it was, and there's other places I could name in the world that are the same, one side of the country to the other, which shows the effect of what we're talking about. Yeah,
absolutely. And
that's not superstition. That's, anyone can do it. You can walk across to Mexico and have a look for yourself.
Yep.
And one thing is that the Roman system works very well with pagan nations like South America, the Incas and the Aztecs and all these pagan people there, that they were gradually converted over at the point of a gun in most cases, but they ended up being Roman Catholic strongholds in South America. But in the main, they're not prosperous nations.
Nope, not to the same extent as Protestants. And the Roman Catholic system, they're very good at what's called syncretism, where they will just simply adopt in the old pagan beliefs in the beliefs of these.
Exactly what Constantine did in the 300 AD.
Yep, that's exactly right.
They haven't changed the rules.
When the conquistadors, these Roman Catholic Spanish soldiers and explorers, went into the Americas, primarily in Central and South America, they actually built, the priests actually built their cathedrals right on the Inca temples. So if you're in a place like Cusco, Peru, you can have an old Inca temple of the sun god, and they built the cathedral right on top of it.
Yep.
And that
Go
did
figure. Yeah.
and that did a number of things. They could syncretize the beliefs into it,
Yep.
but then they could also like dig under there on those sites, and they could do whatever they wanted to
Relics.
do.
Dig up the
Yeah, look,
relics. And
they could dig up the relics and do whatever they wanted to do because they were able. They just planted their flag and say, "Well, we're in charge now religiously, and we can do what we want to do."
yep. hmm
And we were talking about Britain and the English-speaking countries, and that's a really good transition because the next historical event we're going to talk about is England. We're going to talk King James I, the Gunpowder Plot, Guy Fawkes. So why don't you tell the viewers what are some of those events in history?
Yeah. So when I was a kid growing up, we used to have Guy Fawkes night, and every family and every kid looked forward to that, so we could have firecrackers and skyrockets. We ran amok, and it was a great time. We had a big bonfire, and it's non-existent now. If you said to a kid in Australia, "What's Guy Fawkes night?" they'd say, "What do you mean?" So we knew. It was a little saying, remember the 5th of November, and went on something else. So that was the date of the gunpowder plot, where Guy Fawkes planted dynamite under the Parliament to blow it to bits. And he was foiled, and I think he was hung, drawn, and quartered, which
he was
made sure he was dead. It was severe justice, but that's what happened.
That's back when governments in the West actually decided to prosecute their traitors instead of aiding and abetting them. That's when we actually dealt with our traitors.
It got the message across, I guess.
Yeah, we don't do that anymore. If somebody commits treason today, we're like, what?
Yeah. Give him a rap on the knuckles. You can't do that. But look, the Protestants were guilty too. I think Calvin has been labelled as a murderer because he was. They say he was complicit in the death of Servetus, who was had opposite views of scripture and teaching, and he was put to death. But all Calvin said was, don't put him to death in the flames, but use a sword instead. It's more biblical because that's another subject we could go on to. But
right.
there were in many cases, the Anabaptists suffered badly at the time of the Reformation. So there were three gangs, if you were. There was the Roman Catholics, the Calvinists, and the Anabaptists, and they all at each other. And in England, especially, the Roman Catholics got beat up quite a bit, and the Protestants got beat up quite a bit.
Yep. I do believe that Calvin, he was all men of God. Still sin, and at times sin grievously. And we don't have to condone everything Calvin did to believe that God used him for good.
Yeah, and same with Luther. Some of Luther's doctrine was way off course. And it's I think, to show us that there's only one inspired book, and that's the one that we live our life by according to the rules contained therein.
Yeah. And I think, and this is when we're talking about leading up to the Gunpowder Plot, what really happened was the Reformation in England. It had really got going under Wycliffe and the Lollards, but the Lollards were Bible-believing Christians, but they were suppressed. Yes. And the established church in England was Roman Catholic up until the time of King Henry VIII. Yes. But this is an amazing story because God used the sinful lusts of one man to help advance the cause of biblical religion, because he sinfully wanted to divorce his wife without any grounds.
Yes, and that's what the Roman Catholics, that's the big backstop of Roman Catholicism against Protestantism, goes right back to that very point that they broke away because he wouldn't do the right thing.
Yep, that's
and they say we're the true church because that's where it all separated and fell to bits, if you like.
Yep, and they have thrown that mud again and again, but they also have constantly murdered the people who have really, I think, have been the ones who have truly represented the teachings of the apostles. Because we find the teachings of the apostles not in their preconceived traditions, but in Scripture. That's where the teachings of because we want to be biblical, But I digress. But yeah, King Henry VIII he started this process of Protestant the Church of England becoming Protestant, and you had groups like the Puritans who wanted to purify the church. Some tried to work within the Church of England, some tried to separate out. And then Queen Elizabeth I was a Protestant, and the Jesuits tried to kill her 4 or 5 times.
Yeah.
She's the Virgin Queen, and then so she leaves the throne to King James VI of Scotland, who becomes King James I of England, and he doesn't go Roman Catholic either, so they want to kill him. And I think a big reason why they wanted to kill him is because he sanctioned this Bible Project.
Yep.
And the King James version of the Bible is one of the greatest historical gatherings of biblical scholarship in history.
Yes.
Many of those scholars were godly men. They were men in whom the Holy Spirit was working, and they were masters of the languages and of the grammar of Hebrew and Greek.
You're opening a can of worms.
I know I am. But anyway, but the Jesuits wanted to stop that because King James I had sanctioned that Bible. So as you were talking about, they sanctioned this Roman Catholic soldier named Guy Fawkes, who was a mercenary, and they hire him to put these gun barrels under Parliament. This is like a James Bond novel. They have these bombs, this dynamite, this gunpowder, and they're going to blow up the king and both houses of Parliament at the exact same time. And the guards come down to the cellar and literally stop it moments before it's lit. And the men who stopped it said this was an act of God that stopped it. This was the providence of God that stopped this travesty from taking place.
It's like the Spanish Armada when it came to invade England. They vastly outnumbered the English fleet. The English were done for, but the wind changed and blew their ships onto the rocks and smashed that Armada to bits. How do you explain that?
That's an act of God. It's the Puritans, they had a term where they would talk about easily visible providences. Sometimes there are providences that are so evident that it is unmistakable that it is the hand of God working right before our very eyes. And that is really how we should understand history, is that everything is ordained by the sovereign hand of God, both the good and the bad.
Yes.
Yeah. So, that's excellent. So that really is, so the Jesuits, they were working, and this really continued on even after King James I. They were using King Charles I to try to bring Roman Catholicism back into the church. They were using
Scotland, there was massive battles there.
There were massive battles. The English Civil War was essentially that conflict between the pure version of Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was a Jesuit agent. He was an infiltrator. He was trying to promote Arminianism in the English church, and he was persecuting the Protestants. And I think God really used men like Cromwell eventually to that led to religious liberty for the various Protestant denominations in England.
Yep.
Yeah.
And sadly, they've lost all that now.
We're at the point where in England, as you mentioned earlier, we're throwing people praying silently, mentally in their heads into, they're not even disturbing the public peace, and they're being thrown in jail and prison for praying. That's how much things have turned around.
Yep. Once great Protestant nation.
Yeah. And this is, I really do believe the decline of the West is because we've turned away from our Bibles. We are in rebellion against God, and we are under the judgment.
Look at the great Christian nations, Scotland, England, Holland, United States, Australia to some degree, become decadent nations.
Yep. Yeah.
Germany.
We've allowed our riches and we've turned to secularism and materialism, and we've really bitten the sovereign hand that's fed us.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, that's excellent. So moving forward in history now, when we come to the 18th century, because one of the things we have not really talked about yet is that when we look at the New World Order conspiracy, which is what some people would call a conspiracy theory, but it's not, it's history. This really goes back to the Jesuits, and they founded what is called the Bavarian Illuminati. What can you tell us about that?
Adam Weishaupt, I think, was a Jesuit, and he was the founder. And My understanding is a lot of these organisations are linked together in ways we can't understand. The skull and crossbones that you mentioned earlier, the Illuminati, the Masons, the Jesuits, even Zionism. Who the learned elders of Zion? Read a little bit about those guys.
The Rothschilds.
So, the Rothschilds, New World Orders, and even WEF and WHO, United Nations, all of these things are all, I can't figure it out, but I know there's something sinister in all of these things. I've read a lot about them, but
Right.
I think it's like a spider web that's just going out, and people are being caught by this in this trap and not even knowing.
Yep. And not to shamelessly plug, but this is what my book, The Hidden Enemies, this is what is about. It is about this exposing this New World Order conspiracy. And you said it exactly right, that the Bavarian Illuminati, that's really the term. Well, the Illuminati is really the term for the umbrella organization that governs all of these secret societies, whether it's the Masons or Skull and Bones.
Well, I think the Jesuits are above the Illuminati.
Yes, they are.
And they say the 33rd degree of the Masons is Jesuit something. So
the high degrees of Masonry were written by Jesuits. Mm-hmm. And in the College of Claremont College in France, the degrees of the Scottish Rite were written by Jesuit priests in that. And the reason why it's called the Scottish Rite is because after the English Civil War, the Stuart dynasty was dethroned from England, and the Stuart dynasty was from Scotland. The Jesuits wanted to put them back on the throne of Britain. And so they wanted to use Masonry as an avenue to infiltrate Protestant countries. And that's why the high degrees are called the Scottish Rite.
And just to interrupt for a little bit there, Joe, some of my family were Masons. I almost joined it at one stage earlier in my life, and God slapped me across the face and prevented that happening. But they seemed to be doing good for community, and the original thing was if you were a Mason, you couldn't be a Roman Catholic and vice versa, and they sort of put up this veneer that they hated each other.
Yep.
For example, the police force, you got nowhere unless you were either a Mason or a Catholic, and I think that's probably the same today, probably in your country as well. But it's an illusion. We have two major political parties here, as you do, and they seem to be diametrically opposed, but they're not.
Right.
They're called left wing and right wing in our country, but as one wag put it, it's the same bird.
Two wings.
Yeah.
That's right. This is the Coke Pepsi fallacy. They give you the appearance of having separate choices, but behind the scenes they're working for the same powers.
Yes.
Now you understand, of course, as Christians, we're going to align with our respective conservative parties in terms of the beliefs.
Yep.
But what you need to understand is that these politicians often don't believe what they say they believe.
Yep.
It's this is called the Hegelian dialectic, thesis and an antithesis and a synthesis. And they do this. They do whatever it takes to get their agenda across. And as you were talking about, the Bavarian Illuminati, and the Illuminati has continued until this day. But really, the term Illuminati really goes back to the 1500s. In Spain, it was called the Alumbrados.
Yes.
And Ignatius of Loyola was a part of that group, the Alumbrados. And he was, for a brief time, even imprisoned by the Inquisition out of suspicion of being a part of that group, until he got out, and then he founded the Jesuits. But the Jesuits control this entire Illuminati structure. And Adam Weishaupt was a professor of canon law at the University of Ingolstadt in Bavaria, which is a Roman Catholic stronghold around close to Munich. It's the same place where Hitler comes from, actually. Yeah. Well, Hitler's originally from Austria, but his early days in the Nazi Party were in Munich. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. But and what Adam Weishaupt did was he said, we're going to use this system of Masonry that already existed, and we're going to use these Masonic lodges like Trojan horses to advance our political agenda. And
Exactly.
one of the first things they did was work to orchestrate the French Revolution.
Yep.
All of the high political leaders in France, men like Robespierre and Georges Danton and Mirabeau, these French men who were
Voltaire.
Voltaire, the famous Masonic
Yep.
French
Yep.
philosopher, these men who were
Even later on, Karl Marx got his instructions from these guys.
Karl Marx worked closely with the Rothschilds and the Illuminati to found Marxism as the philosophy that bears his name, and he founded workers' organizations called the Internationale. And this is an important distinction, because when you hear communism today, that is only the outward workings of globalism, the Illuminati, and the Jesuits.
Yes.
So when you hear communism, think Jesuits and think Illuminati.
100%.
Yeah, and I'm sure as we're going to move forward here, we're going to cover that in more detail. But we're moving forward toward the modern day here. But now we're going to talk about the American Civil War and the assassination of President Lincoln. There's so much in our nation. You hear how this is taught wrong again and again and again, and there's so much that is convoluted and mistaught about the American Civil War. So, what can you tell me about my own nation's false history?
Well, I could write it on the back of a matchbox, Joe, because I was raised with the traditional narrative that the South had slaves, and that was a bad idea, and so the North came down to release the slaves. But I've come to believe that that's not 100% true. There were the slave. There were black battalions in the South fighting against the North, and so that sort of knocks that idea a little bit on the head. But I think it was that they wanted to break away from the Union, and that wasn't going to happen.
Yep. Now, I personally believe that it was, from a biblical standpoint, that the slaves could not have been kept in perpetual chattel slavery. It's a good thing they were freed. We should be happy that they are freed. The Old Testament system of slavery was essentially just indentured servitude with a purpose of paying off debt. When you study the biblical system of slavery in the Bible, it is all about.
They were released on the Jubilee as well.
Yeah, they were released every 7 years. So what the biblical system of slavery is not the same as what was practiced in America. But I believe that the South, as wrong as they may have been about slavery, they had a constitutional right to secede from the Union. And that is shown in places like when you look at the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment, all powers not expressly delegated to the federal government are delegated to the states. And
same in Australia, we have that same rule.
We have that same rule.
It's been trodden underfoot because our people don't know.
And that goes back to the Protestant political tradition, and that even goes back to charters like the Magna Carta. There is I could get caught in the weeds on that, but the representative systems of government and the freedom and individual liberties we've enjoyed in the Protestant West
come back from there.
It comes back from a biblical worldview and Protestant Christianity.
Yep.
And I don't think that the South was right about everything, but I don't think that they were these evil Nazis as they are portrayed. I think there were many.
Some of the slides admitted that they were treated well. So, for example, if you had a Christian slave owner, and I'm sure there were, they wouldn't have them working on the Sabbath day, and they would have treated those slaves kindly. And there's plenty of stories like that.
Yep, and I think some got mistreated, but I think many were treated very well. There was spectrum. And the South, just as there's still a remnant of that Bible Belt today, but even more so back then, that it was a place of a high concentration of biblical Christians.
Yeah, well, you still have your Southern Baptists that have come down from that era.
Yep.
We know about the Southern Baptists in Australia. That's just a common saying.
There was the men who founded Southern Seminary were godly men, men like Boyce and other men. And there were a number of godly Presbyterians in the South as well as Baptists. And, it's amazing how
even leaders in the army was it Jackson was a
Yeah. Stonewall Jackson is
yeah
a good if you want to really sell people on why Calvinism is the way to go, you should study Stonewall Jackson, because he was called Stonewall because he'd have bullets whizzing by his head and he would
yeah
just be calm and peaceful and serene. And everybody's like, this guy is fearless. And they asked him, how on earth can you be so courageous when everybody is shooting at you? And he said, well, God has ordained the moment of my death, and I am taught to be as peaceful in battle as I am in my own home.
yeah
And therefore, he was willing to be able to lead his armies to victory time and time again. There's
yeah
a great story, if I can digress on this, where he had an aide, General Ewell, who was
yeah I know
essentially
the
an
story.
agnostic when he served under General Jackson.
Yeah
And he saw that Jackson won victory after victory. And after every battle that Jackson won, he got on his knees in prayer and gave thanks and praise to God.
yeah.
And Ewell finally was so astounded by what he had seen time and again. He said, I don't know much about this religion, but I got to have it.
I know another story from the Civil War where a young lad was whistling around and the bullets were flying, and it might have been Jackson, I think, that said to this lad, what's the chief end of man? And this kid said, man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. And the general or major or whatever it was said, I thought you were a Covenant boy. He was just no problem.
It's amazing that there were revivals in both armies, really, during the Civil War, and that God used that carnage to drive many of those soldiers to prayer and to drive them to Christ. And there's so much more that can be said about that. You know, Robert E. Lee has been so villainized. It's amazing that before the war started, he was against seceding from the Union, and he was against owning slaves. He was opposed to it morally. And he even inherited slaves at the time he married, and he immediately freed them. But he would not fight against his home state of Virginia because it was his home. And he fought with his own people because he believed that was the honorable thing to do. And today we're pulling down his statues because everybody's saying this man is an evil white supremacist Nazi. And that is not what he is. Even in the North, he was greatly respected. Everybody said this man is a man of honor. Everybody said this man is a man of character and integrity and a man of prayer. And he was a humble man. And he was a man who treated everybody with respect and dignity. And he was about as opposite of a Hitler type as you could imagine. But today, the only thing that people know about him is that he fought for slavery, when that is a mischaracterization of the truth.
Yep.
So, but there's some interesting things politically that were going on, even in the North. When we look at Lincoln, who fought to maintain the Union, it did not spare him from the wrath of the Jesuits. So, what can you tell us about Lincoln and his death?
I don't know much about Lincoln. I know that there's a false narrative of the guy, what was his alleged murderer, Fawkes?
No, not Guy Fawkes.
Wilkes.
John Wilkes Booth. Yep.
John Wilkes Booth. I just couldn't remember his name. But I know that that family that hid him, the mother, I think, eventually was executed.
Mary Surratt.
Yeah.
She was correctly executed as a conspirator.
Yeah. So I don't know what he did to upset them, but I know it was a Jesuit.
It was a Jesuit
organisation that he was dealt with. Same with JFK, who was one of their own. But I got all of them.
Well, let me step in and help you out here, because John Wilkes Booth was working with a group of Jesuit-led Roman Catholic conspirators, and Lincoln famously, one of the greatest Protestant books ever written against Rome is a book called 50 Years in the Church of Rome by Charles Chiniquy. And Charles Chiniquy was a French-Canadian Roman Catholic priest who ended up coming down to the area around Chicago. And he saw the corruption of the bishops and the priests and the hierarchy with his own eyes. And over a period of many years, God gradually opened his eyes to the errors of Rome, which eventually when I read that book, it's a tearjerker. when you read about his agony of his soul at nights, he was up crying over,
Yeah.
Lord, help me know what to do. It's an
Yeah.
absolute tearjerker of a book.
Mm.
And he eventually got framed on false charges in the Illinois court system. And there was a certain famous historical figure from American history who ended up being his lawyer, and that man was named Abraham Lincoln.
Ah, yeah, I remember that story. Yeah.
And
Yep, I remember.
Abraham Lincoln,
What
being
a piece of kidding.
he was a brilliant lawyer, and
Yep.
he successfully defended Chiniquy from these false charges, and
I
he was
remember now. Yep.
acquitted. And it's a great story where Abraham Lincoln is joyful at their victory, and he's looking at Charles Chiniquy, and he's weeping. And he says, Mr. Chiniquy, why on earth are you weeping? You should essentially be joyful over your acquittal. And Chiniquy says, I'm not weeping for myself, sir. I am weeping for you, because the Jesuits never forget an offense. And I guarantee you that they are going to come after you. And that's essentially what happened. And Charles Chiniquy remained friends with President Lincoln for the rest of his life up until his death. He even visited him in the White House a few times.
Yeah.
But eventually this conspiracy led.
They never forget.
They never forgive, and they never forget. And
hey, Joe, can we wind up? I've probably gone a bit longer than it was. I was able to, but we've only scratched the surface.
Why don't we can plan on doing a part two.
Part two.
Yep. So we'll
because
plan
we haven't come to the good bits yet.
No. So we'll plan on doing a part two covering the 20th century and the modern day. But I'm just gonna. Yep. So we'll finish up our thought. So just finishing up this thought here that yes, Lincoln was killed by a Roman Catholic conspiracy with John Wilkes Booth, a man by name John Surratt, who went and fled and hid in the Vatican, and American agents found him, and so that they've had instrumental workings in the history of the United States and in other countries, even in your country.
Yes.
And we've covered a lot of great history. We've covered a lot of great ground. So we will plan on finishing this up in part two.
Get up to the 19th and 20th centuries.
So Gavin, it's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed your time. Thank you for coming on. I'm going to end the recording here, and then we can finish up talking off camera after that. So thanks for being on the show.
Good on you, Joe. Been a pleasure.
All right, everybody. That's been this installment of our conversation about the Jesuits, part 1. So thanks, everybody. God bless.
If you enjoyed this video, then check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.